For Rome, winning wars was not enough on its own. They had plans already in place for the defeated. For their enemies, losing a battle was actually nothing, because the real ordeal began after that. In other words, for the defeated, it wasn't the end. On the contrary, things became even harder. From the outside, this situation might seem quite ruthless, but Rome's aim was not merely to mete out merciless punishment. Their true objective was to instill fear, serve as a warning, and leave a mark that would deter anyone from ever challenging them again. Perhaps the most unsettling part is this: much of what was done was documented. In other words, these were not rumors or exaggerations. They were entirely real events. Let's now take a closer look at what Rome did to its defeated enemies. Starting at number 10, and this one happened in broad daylight, in front of the entire city of Rome. When a Roman general returned from a major military victory, the city celebrated with a triumph, a formal procession through the streets of Rome that ended at the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. For the Roman public, it was a celebration. For the defeated enemy, it was a carefully designed exercise in total humiliation. The defeated king, general, or leader walked in chains at the center of the procession, visible to the entire Roman population. He was displayed not as a warrior, but as an object, proof of Roman superiority made flesh and paraded through the streets. The crowd threw things. People shouted. The defeated man had no response available to him. At the end of the procession, he was either executed in the Tullianum prison or, in some cases, kept alive to be displayed again at future events. Jugurtha, the Numidian king who had fought Rome for years, was paraded in Marius's triumph of 104 BC and then strangled in the Tullianum. Vercingetorix, the Gallic leader who had come closest to defeating Caesar, was kept alive for 6 years specifically to be displayed in Caesar's triumph of 46 BC, then executed. The waiting was part of the punishment. The Romans understood that keeping a man alive in captivity while his people had been conquered was a specific kind of cruelty that execution did not provide. Our 9th entry is one Rome turned on its own soldiers, not the enemy. When a Roman unit broke in battle, fled without orders, or committed collective acts of cowardice, the punishment was decimation, the killing of 1 in every 10 soldiers by the other 9. The soldiers drew lots. The 1 in 10 who drew the fatal lot was beaten to death by his own tentmates with clubs and stones. The surviving 9 then had to sleep outside the camp and eat barley instead of wheat for a period afterward. The psychological design of decimation was more sophisticated than simple punishment. By requiring the survivors to kill the victim, the Roman military made the entire unit complicit in the punishment. There was no executioner to blame. The man who drew the short lot might have been one of the bravest soldiers in the unit. The randomness was the point. It created collective accountability rather than individual responsibility. Every man in a formation subject to decimation knew that cowardice might get his neighbor killed rather than himself. Crassus famously decimated 500 men after the disastrous early performance of his forces against Spartacus, reportedly the first decimation in centuries. The display of severity was deliberate. He was trying to make his soldiers more afraid of him than of Spartacus. It worked. His army subsequently performed significantly better. Number 8 on our list, and this time it wasn't soldiers being punished. It was entire cities. After the destruction of Carthage in 146 BC, Rome sold the surviving population, estimated at between 50,000 and 200,000 people, into slavery in a single operation. After the sack of Corinth the same year, the male population was killed and the women and children enslaved. These were not exceptional acts in Roman practice. They were institutional outcomes applied to cities that had resisted beyond the point Rome considered acceptable. The scale of Roman slave-taking after major military victories was industrial. Caesar's Gallic campaigns produced an estimated 1 million slaves over 8 years. The markets at Delos could process 10,000 slaves in a single day. The Romans built an entire economic infrastructure around the assumption that military victory would produce large numbers of enslaved people, and they designed the slave trade accordingly. What made this particularly brutal was not just the scale, but the specificity of the decision. Roman commanders could grant mercy to a surrendered population. The choice to enslave was a choice made by specific men on specific days, and it was recorded in the ancient sources with the matter-of-factness that institutional normality produces. Livy records the enslavement of populations the way he records troop movements, as administrative facts. Coming in at number 7, 130 miles. That is how far this particular punishment stretched. After suppressing the Spartacus slave revolt in 71 BC, Crassus crucified 6,000 prisoners along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome, a distance of approximately 130 miles. One cross every 22 meters for the entire length of the road. The crosses were left standing until the bodies had completely decomposed, a process that took months. Every traveler on Rome's most important road saw them for the entire duration. Crucifixion was not normally applied to Roman citizens. It was specifically a punishment for slaves, rebels, and non-citizen criminals. Its use against the Spartacus survivors was therefore a deliberate statement about their status. These were slaves who had pretended to be something else, and they were being returned to the category of object rather than person in the most visible way Rome had available. The Appian Way display was also a message to every slave in Italy. The road ran through the agricultural heartland, where most of Rome's enslaved population worked. The 6,000 crosses were visible to the people most likely to be tempted by another revolt. The display was not spontaneous cruelty. It was calculated communication, and it worked. There was no comparable slave revolt in Italy for generations afterward. At number 6, we have perhaps the most calculated act on this entire list, because the decision was made before the war even started. The Third Punic War ended in 146 BC with the complete destruction of Carthage after a 3-year siege. The Roman Senate had decided, on the motion primarily associated with Cato the Elder, that Carthage must be destroyed. The decision preceded the war. Rome went to war having already decided on the outcome, regardless of what Carthage did. The siege lasted 3 years, partly because the Carthaginians, when they realized the Romans intended total destruction regardless of surrender terms, fought with the specific desperation of people who had nothing left to lose. They reportedly melted down bronze statues to make weapons. Women cut off their hair to make bowstrings. The city was defended, building by building, street by street. When the Romans finally broke through, they fought through the city for 6 days of continuous street combat. At the end, the surviving population was enslaved, the buildings were systematically demolished, and the site was cursed. A city that had been one of the great metropolises of the ancient world was reduced to rubble in 6 days. The site remained uninhabited for over a century. Our fifth entry is where things get deeply personal, because Rome understood that destroying a man's family in front of him was a different kind of cruelty than anything a battlefield could produce. When Rome captured a foreign king or leader of significance, the execution was often staged so that family members were forced to watch. This was not incidental cruelty, but deliberate policy. The complete destruction of everything the defeated person had built and loved was considered part of the total defeat that Rome intended to impose. Perseus, the last king of Macedon, was captured after the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC. He and his family were displayed in Aemilius Paulus's triumph and then held in a Roman prison. His sons died in captivity. The ancient sources describe Perseus watching his children deteriorate and die while being unable to do anything, a specific kind of long-term cruelty that outlasted the battle itself by years. The Romans also practiced the execution of the entire male line of a defeated royal family to prevent future challenges. When a dynasty was conquered, its continuation was the threat. The elimination of every potential claimant was strategic rather than personal. It was terrible and it was deliberate, and the Romans recorded it in the same administrative language they used for everything else. Number 4 on our list, and this one is unique because Rome knew exactly what it felt like to be on the receiving end. When a Roman army was defeated so decisively that it had to surrender in the field, the victorious enemy sometimes imposed the specific humiliation of passing under the yoke, a frame made of spears under which the soldiers had to walk, bent and disarmed. For the Romans, this was one of the most intolerable humiliations imaginable. Rome imposed this on others. After the Battle of the Caudine Forks in 321 BC, the Romans themselves were forced to pass under the yoke, one of the most traumatic events in Republican memory. When Rome subsequently defeated the Samnites, the humiliation was returned with interest. The Romans, who imposed the yoke on defeated enemies, understood exactly what they were doing because they knew what it had meant when it was done to them. Roman commanders also imposed physical branding, forced labor on public works, and the permanent removal of civic rights on conquered populations. The yoke was the symbolic version of what the other punishments made literal, the conversion of free people into something less. At number 3, we reach a punishment that went beyond death, because death alone was not considered enough. For defeated enemies of sufficient status, Rome developed a punishment that went beyond death, the systematic erasure of the person from history. Damnatio Memoriae, the condemnation of memory, meant that inscriptions were chiseled off monuments, statues were destroyed, or had their faces removed, official records were altered, and the name of the condemned was forbidden to be spoken or written. The practical effect was to make a person retroactively not have existed. Buildings they had constructed were rededicated to someone else. Coins bearing their image were melted or defaced. Family members who bore their name were required to change it. The Romans understood that memory was a form of continued existence, and that its destruction was a punishment that the physical death of the person did not accomplish. This was applied most extensively to Roman emperors who were condemned after death, but it was also used against defeated foreign leaders who had been significant enough to have their existence recorded. The goal was not only to punish the individual, but to remove the inspiration their memory might provide to future resistance. Our second entry. And here Rome stopped targeting people and went after something even harder to replace. Roman armies did not merely defeat enemies militarily. They stripped the religious infrastructure of the defeated people as a deliberate act of cultural destruction. Temples were looted, sacred objects were carried to Rome as trophies, and the specific religious identity of the defeated people was materially dismantled. The sack of Jerusalem in AD 70 is the most documented example. Titus's army removed the menorah, the table of shewbread, and the silver trumpets from the temple, objects whose religious significance to the Jewish population was absolute. These were displayed in the triumph of Titus and then stored in the Temple of Peace in Rome. The Arch of Titus, still standing in Rome today, shows the looted temple objects being carried in the triumphal procession. The message of this kind of looting was precise. Your gods could not protect you. The objects that represented divine protection had been taken by Rome and were now trophies in Roman temples. The defeat was not only military and political, but theological. It was designed to convince the conquered population that resistance was not only futile, but cosmically unjustified. And finally, number 1. Everything on this list was a piece of the same system, and this is where that system led. The most extreme outcome Rome could impose on a defeated enemy was total annihilation, the killing of the entire population of a city that had resisted beyond what Rome considered acceptable. This was not applied universally. Rome preferred submission to destruction because submission produced tribute, slaves, and manpower. But when a city resisted after a point Rome had decided was the final one, the result could be the complete end of that community. The most chilling aspect of Roman total annihilation was its procedural quality. It was not the result of soldiers in the grip of combat rage. It was a command decision made before the final assault that when the walls were breached, there would be no quarter. The soldiers who carried out these orders were not acting outside their institutional role. They were executing a policy. Polybius, who was present at the destruction of Carthage, describes the Roman soldiers killing every living thing they encountered as they fought through the city, not because they were out of control, but because they had been ordered to. The most disturbing thing about the systematic brutality of Roman military practice was not that it was exceptional. It was that it was normal. What set the Romans apart from others was not that they were more ruthless, but how and for what purpose they acted. The events we just witnessed were not random occurrences. They were all decisions that had been carefully considered, planned, and deliberately carried out. Orders came from the higher ranks, and the soldiers, as part of the system, were compelled to carry them out. Rome gained power not only through warfare, but also by instilling fear, because everyone who faced them knew this. If you resist, you know exactly what will happen to you. That's why most people didn't even choose to fight. So ruthlessness wasn't something separate for Rome. It was part of the system they built, and perhaps that's why they were able to survive for so long. Do you think Rome could have remained just as powerful if it hadn't used such harsh methods?